as she said, my name is Martin Carcasson. I'm a communication professor here at CSU. I think this is starting my 8th year here in Fort Collins. And about 6 years ago, I started this organization called the Center for Public Deliberation. I started the organization basically to serve as an impartial resource for the Northern Colorado community. My background as a communication professor, my research, my dissertation focused on how we talked about political issues, primarily how presidents talked about political issues. I think it's interesting that Clinton's actually speaking tonight because he was one of the ones that brought me into this work. Was when Clinton did his race initiative at the beginning of his second term, it produced a lot of documents on helping communities have conversations about race. And that was the first time I really got exposed to a lot of these kind of processes, dialogue, deliberation processes that I'll be talking about tonight. So I published a lot of papers, did a lot of work, primarily writing about how badly politicians talk about political issues. And my work finally transitioned because I kind of got bored with talking about how bad it was and decided I'll take a shot at trying to improve it in a sense. And part of that too came from working with my classes. I teach argumentation class, argumentation debate, and those type of things. So we could do some really innovative things in our classrooms, getting students talking about issues from lots of different perspectives and really working through these issues. But then they would challenge me because they would never see that outside the classroom, right? They would never see that on TV or those type of things. So I actually started this center 7 years ago just to give those students an opportunity to take some of these concepts we were playing with in class and see if they'd work in the community. And what we found out pretty quickly was that we were filling a pretty big void. We thought when we started that we would be picking events and picking topics and hoping people show up and have an interesting conversation. But pretty quickly, as soon as we do an event, we would be contacted by organizations to help them with their events. And basically for the last 6 years, we haven't had an event of our own. We've done things for the city, we've done things for the school district, we've done things for the university, we've done things for United Way, for the Community Foundation, for the Early Childhood Council, for the Bike Fort Collins, and et cetera. And I'll have a list. Actually, I have a list right there. Those are some of the projects that we've been working on. And basically what I do with the program is I train undergraduate students. We bring in about 15 students a semester that make a year-long commitment. So they take a 3-hour class their first semester to learn to be impartial facilitators and process experts. And then they come back for at least a second semester. So every semester I have about 15 new students and 15 experienced students. And we run events for people. We just kind of serve and we do this as a public service, as a resource for the community. So this is kind of an example of one of the projects we've been working on with the senior center. So the 2 students on the left, one of them facilitating, one of them note-taking. We had about 20 tables going at the same time, so about 200 people show up. We split them all into small group discussions, and then my students are leading those discussions. I'm up front leading some large group process, and we have clickers, and we kind of grab data in lots of different ways. We design, run the process, and report on the process for whatever organizations we're helping. Basically what we're trying to do is help people have difficult conversations, right? And you'll get a better sense of this as we go through, but we're trying to shift in a sense from how polarized we are to really what we're dealing with, right? And we're not assuming we're all going to agree in the end. We're not assuming that we're all just going to come together and hold hands and sing Kumbaya, but we want to focus on what are our actual disagreements rather than these perception disagreements. So we can still disagree with each other, but perhaps not assume we're Hitler. So what I'll be doing tonight, and I'll be talking probably for at least the hour 15, maybe an hour 30, depending on how many stories I kind of throw in as we go. But I do want to leave at least 30 minutes for individual questions or to kind of go back to anything. The way I tend to do this is I go pretty fast, just kind of throw a bunch of concepts out there. I'm kind of a graphic learner, so you'll see kind of a lot of charts. I've got a couple of copies of some of the kind of main slides in here. And then I can go back to anything you want to and talk a little bit more kind of as you go. But I'll start with talking about the nature of public problems in the 21st century. What kind of problems are we dealing with? And again, I'm coming from a communication perspective on how I look at these things. And then look at the flaws of the current methods of addressing, or the ways we're trying to deal with these problems. Not only don't work, but they're actually counterproductive, and they make the problems worse, and they make us trying to solve the problems worse. And then I'll introduce deliberative practice as a promising and growing alternative as a way of changing the way we talk to each other. Which, the title of the presentation is what kind of talk does democracy need? And then I'll finish talking a little bit more about the series that we're starting, that this is a kickoff to, that you'll get some additional chances this year to do this. So the basic 2 questions I'm asking, in my own work, I am a tenured faculty member at CSU, so I do the research, but I also very much do the practice. The word for it now is a pracademic, right? That's combining both the practice and the theory in a sense. So I constantly kind of go back and forth between books and the real world out there. But I ask, how do we best address public problems in a diverse democracy? What kind of communication or engagement processes help us solve those problems? How do we need to talk to each other to be able to deal with the problems that we're dealing with in democracy? And a couple years ago, I came across a distinction that's actually made by some engineers. It was originally made in an article in the early 1970s that made the distinction between tame problems and wicked problems. And it really kind of helped me think about what we're really talking about in a way. So they frame tame problems as these problems that are technical, that experts can kind of start studying tame problems, and the more they study it, the more they converge, the more they think alike, right? Tame problems, you can kind of take them apart, each person can kind of research it and kind of come up with a solution. And basically their argument was this is how they learned to solve problems as engineers, right? The problem is they were then hired as city planners or working for city government, these type of things, and they were asked to solve these problems that didn't fit this mold, right? So the rational kind of linear decision-making, problem-solving process that they learned didn't work. So they came up with the concept of wicked problems. And I'll spend some time with this because it's pretty important. And this is the first bullet point here is probably the most important. That wicked problems inherently involve competing underlying values or paradoxes or trade-offs that can't be resolved by science. That a wicked problem is when we're dealing, and particularly prevalent in diverse democracies, diverse communities, right? That no matter what we do, we've got competing underlying values that are good things that we have to make decisions between, right? There's inherent tensions to these. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of these to kind of play with. This is one of the projects we've been working on for a few years. We actually started with Norm in the library doing a debate about the Glade Reservoir probably about 5 years ago or so. And then last year we did a process with the CSU Water Institute and the Community Foundation on how Northern Colorado should deal with its water problem in the coming years. And it was basically an educational program to say, this is going to become more and more of an issue. We need as a community to be able to talk about this issue in more productive ways as we kind of go through. So part of the analysis that we did as we kind of went through, and this is kind of a basic part of what we do with our work, is to tease out, to bring out the underlying values inherent to this issue. Right? So one thing I'm going to ask you is you look at this kind of list of 9 kind of basic values, right? Which of these are bad things? Which of these would you just rather just get rid of, right? None of them, right? I mean, if you take them one at a time, they're all kind of good things, right? We want all those things, right? The problem is, can we have all those things? Are there any examples of getting more of one of those things means we probably get less of another, right? That we might need to make choices, right? I mean, the basic kind of situation in requires a much longer explanation, but the basic facts is we live in a pretty semi-arid area. We don't get that much rain, right? But for 100 years, we've built up an agricultural area around here, basically using the water from snowmelt. We get a lot of water in May and June, not much else. So we capture a lot of that water and we irrigate that water and so we have this whole farm system, but we're also a wonderful place to live. So thousands and thousands of people are coming here and they need water and cities need water, right? So obviously these tensions are coming up now, right? And we've got all these things, but we can't have all of them, and we need to have the tough conversation of how do we figure out either how to balance these right, or, and this is important, or how do we get innovative and transcend these tensions and kind of get the best of both worlds in some ways, right? But those kind of conversations are difficult to have. And what you'll get from when I talk about kind of the basic way we talk about issues is we hear from the individual boxes, right? We've got interest groups, we've got people that are passionate about individual boxes that are framing things as I'm for that value, right? And implying somewhat, whether it's purposeful or not, that other people are against that value, right? One thing that we started with these meetings with is we started off saying, you know what? No one's anti-river, right? There's no one out there that's like, if we just get rid of those dang rivers, right? I mean, no one's anti-environment, right? Some people make choices that they think other things are more important than the environment, and the environment suffers. I certainly agree with that, right? But no one, just if they had their choice between a good environment and a bad environment, would pick a bad environment, right? So the issue, and we'll kind of get into this as we go, the issue, a value by definition is a good thing. People tend not to hold negative values, right? So the issues that we're dealing with in a democracy are more about not what values we have, but how we rank them. We tend to all have pretty much the same values. We differ how we rank them. Now, different rankings can be major differences. So again, I'm not saying if we just have a good conversation, we'll all agree and come to consensus, right? We've got some major differences on how we'd all rank these values in different ways. But we just tend to not have that conversation. Because the easier conversation for us to have is to assume I have a set of values and the people that disagree with me reject those values, right? Because then we're not having to deal with the tension. We're not wired to deal with the tensions and the tough choices and the cognitive dissonance that comes with making tough choices between things that are important to us. It's a lot easier to think that we've got good values and the other side doesn't, right? And that's part of the way we need to change our conversations. So we need to think more about value hierarchies, which is what order do we put things in, and value dilemmas. And if we went back to this and I asked everyone to pull out a piece of paper and rank these from 1 to 9, we get lots of different rankings, right? And whenever you put 9th, right, it's not because you hate that thing, right? It's because relative to the other ones, it's less important to you, right? But that has implications to how we make decisions together, and obviously democracy is the art of figuring out how we make decisions together. So we do this, this is another project we worked on with, and it works somewhat with both K-12, this is more for higher ed, about student success. And again, you take each of those individually, they're all good things, right? The problem is pursuing some of them kind of inherently tend to undo the others, right? That we can't get more of what we want without also getting more of what we don't want, or we can't get more of what we want without losing something that we also want. So the dealing with the trade-offs and the tensions. So one other way of thinking about this, what is this? See who wins the prize. The preamble to the Constitution. People typically figure it out at the very end, right? But embedded within that is 5 primary values, right? So if we pull those values out, which is on the left side, and then we kind of translate them into a little bit more kind of modern language, and we could debate this all day long, but just kind of go with me for now, right? We get 5 kind of primary American values, at least as expressed in the preamble. Justice, security, equality, freedom for us, and freedom for future generations, right? Of that list, which do you want to get rid of? Which is bad? None of them, right? They're all good things, right? Which is the most important to you? Just call it out. Which is the most important to you?
Liberty.
Freedom, liberty. What else? Justice, equality, right? So we got differences, right? Which one did you say, sir?
I said liberty.
Okay, so why do you hate justice? Again, that's the point, right? But that's how we talk to each other. We assume, people that disagree with me, they must reject my value. No, we've got some tough choices to make as we go through. So one of the arguments I make is you can look at individual issues and you see them as a wicked issue. If you really think through them, you find these underlining values and tensions, and that's what we need to be talking about, right? And we tend not to talk about that, and I'll get to that in a second, right? What the argument I'm making here is democracy is a wicked problem, right? Democracy inherently, especially diverse democracy, lots of people that think in lots of different ways, inherently we have all these tensions. And the kind of talk democracy needs is the kind of talk that helps us work through those tensions in important ways. Right? So that was just the first bullet point. Inherently involved competing underlying values. Any proposed solution to a wicked problem tends to create new problems. So this is a systemic view, right? Because typically what you do with the tame problem is you kind of put the blinders on and focus on one aspect of the problem and solve it, right? But if all these values are in tension and connected to each other, right, we can do something that increases equality, but then we solve that problem perhaps, right? But then we're causing all these other problems, right? Because it's dealing with all the other values, right? So inherently when we put the blinders on and kind of focus on one aspect, we're losing it. So we need to be able to step back and look at the big picture and think about, okay, how are we dealing with the interactions between all these values in important ways? Optimal solutions to wicked problems often require adaptive changes rather than technical ones. Adaptive changes means people have to change their behavior, right? With a lot of these issues that we're dealing with, we dealt with issues like childhood obesity and quality in school and those type of things. It requires the people or the front line to change the way they do things, right? And all the research shows that people tend not to change the way they do things because someone in authority tells them to do so, right? Especially in the United States. We don't like people telling us what to do. They need to be part of the process. And there's more and more kind of case studies that when people are a part of a process, then they're much more willing to change it. Once they realize the tension and realize the choices, they're much more likely to kind of be involved in that, right? So the notion of adaptive changes, how do we change individual behavior and individual choices in some ways? We're not going to dictate that from on high. We can't have an expert committee figure that out and kind of pass out a memo to people, right? Addressing wicked problems necessitates effective collaboration and communication across multiple perspectives. So how many people think our political system gives us that one? Effective collaboration and communication across multiple perspectives. Not so much. Wicked problems require creativity, innovation, imagination. It's not about the accumulation of knowledge, but it's about the cultivation of wisdom and about judgment, right? And these are kind of key terms. My background's in rhetorical theory, kind of going back to the Greeks and the Romans, and that's, they talked about the need for judgment, not just knowledge, right? Knowledge is important. We'll get into that, right? We need good data, right? But when you're dealing with wicked problems, we're not going to data our way to a solution, right? Data is going to help us lay out the choices for us and help us think about the decisions we need to make. But at some point, we have to make a judgment in knowledge. And the creativity, innovation, and imagination is what's necessary to find the right balance between those things or to transcend them in certain ways. I think we have a lot of creativity and innovation and imagination in our politics, right? It's just all of it's used to make the other side look bad, right? Instead of used to actually solve problems. So one way that I think about this is dividing it up, and again, this is a simplistic way of thinking about things, but I think it helps, in three primary forms of politics. And when I talk about politics, I mean in its broadest forms, it's the art of making decisions together, right? So I'm not just talking about legislatures and elections and those type of things. So one of our dominant forms is adversarial politics, right? Which is two sides, primarily two sides in our country, right? That are fighting it out, trying to mobilize people to their side to kind of win elections or win votes or gain or raise money, or interest groups, again, that are kind of focused on that one perspective kind of going through. I'm not here to say adversarial politics is horrible, we need to get rid of it, right? I also teach a social movements class. I have a lot of respect for activists that have changed the world in kind of in important ways, and that's always a tool that communities need to have in their toolkit for lots of issues, right? The issue is when everything is overly adversarial, when the only voices we hear are the kind of entrenched voices on the sides, that harms the quality of our communication and makes it harder for us to solve problems. We'll kind of get into that, right? Administrative or expert politics is the perspective that experts should make the decision, that these are kind of data-driven kind of things, right? And I work with a lot of experts in my work that when I tell them, yeah, we want to increase the role of the public, they kind of give me a funny look, right? Because experts get frustrated with the public because of the misinformation and those type of things, right? But that's the work that we need to do in a side, and I think I kind of typically convince them as I talk to them, it's not that we're just going to do more public processes, we're going to do different public process. Right? We're going to put the public in a position that the public can do what it's supposed to do. Right? Too often, most of the public process that we have right now, all the public can really do is complain because they're brought in too late. Right? And they're not given a broader role as we can do it. So again, expert politics is very valuable. We need good data for our decisions, right? But experts can't go all the way. So then the alternative that I'm obviously arguing for is this deliberative politics, which we'll get into a little bit more as we go. But you see some of the key terms there: cooperative, participatory, collaborative, mediation, as we go through. It's just changing the way of at least having some issues. Again, each has pros and cons, right? Obviously, to make the case for deliberative politics, I'll be focused on its pros, but I also realize, in a sense, it takes a lot of time, takes a lot of effort, takes a lot of resources, and it expects a lot out of the public, right? It expects them to, not stay home and watch the first football game of the year and come listen to the guy talk, which works sometimes, right? So I could spend all day on this slide. And again, I'm a communication professor, so I'm focused on how we talk about issues in different ways. And the implications of an overly adversarial kind of political culture that we have, and just the way we've set up the incentive process to how we talk to each other, has some significant repercussions and consequences. So often focuses on winning versus solving problems, right? And you don't even have to be cynical about politics. I mean, this is just the way it is, right? You have to win. If you don't win, you're not there in position to do the changes you want to do. So even if you have the noblest of intentions, you have to focus, the winning becomes the most important ends in a sense, so you kind of get to it. But when we're focused on winning versus solving problems, we do a lot of funny things, right? We pick topics based on how well they fit the election needs versus how important the topics are, right? And we do a lot of other things that we'll kind of get into with zero sum. Yeah?
Gene, is this on one of your handouts, or is there something?
Not this list. I'll actually have this whole PowerPoint posted. And my email is really easy. It's just CPD for the Center for Public Deliberation at coloradostate.edu. So you can email me and I can give it to you. Often focuses on blaming versus taking accountability, because that's what works in politics, as we all can tell when it's an election year, right? That it just works more, right? If I take off my deliberation hat and put my political consultant hat on, I'd be telling them to do these things, right? Because that's what tends to work in our atmosphere. It creates a zero-sum game, and particularly with a two-party political system, right? A zero-sum game is a game that there's inherently winners and losers, right? That if something good happens to one side, it's automatically bad for the other side. And the fact that we have a basic two-party system that's now so polarized, it really creates the really odd incentives for communication, right? And again, we don't have to attack either side on here because both of them do it, right? So if you're a Democrat, right, anything good for Republicans is inherently bad. If the Republicans come up with a really good idea, at least part of you as a Democrat has to say, dang it, we don't want them to come up with good ideas, right? Or whoever's not in power doesn't want good things. It makes sense for a Republican right now to not want the economy to get better, at least not until November, mid-November, right? We're dealing with these problems that are wicked problems that have all these paradoxes and things. And on top of that, we put this game on that changes the whole incentive process, right? That creates this whole different kind of mechanism. You know, we got so many examples now where one side comes up with an idea and then the other side likes it, so takes it, and then the other side's against it because they're the ones that got credit for it, even though they came up with it you know. And again, you have examples on both sides of that. It's that zero-sum game. So generally, it incentivizes bad communication. From my perspective as an argumentation professor, right, good arguments get punished in politics, and bad arguments get rewarded. And that's one of the reasons why the quality of our public discourse is so bad and why it's so hard for us to solve problems. It plays into the flaws of human nature. I mean, psychologically, we want things to be simple. We want things to be good versus evil, and we're on the good side, right? And so the election and typical political communication feeds into that. It tells us that. Instead of saying, here are all these 9 values that we all care is important, we're trying to find the right balance between them, it says, hey, it's just one value, and we're for it, and the other side's against it, right? I collect the little plastic cards we get in the mail for election year. They haven't started yet this year, have they? I don't think I've noticed any, you know, but we'll start getting them in, right? And so I've got about 300 of them from the last 6 elections or so, right? And every single one of them basically says, you know, I'm for good jobs and great families and low taxes. No one's against any of those things, right? But they're going to frame things. They're called valence issues in political science. They're going to frame things as no one's against them, right? You're not going to have a political campaign ad coming to you saying, you know, we've got a tough choice to make between these 2 things, and I'm really struggling with that. I'm not sure what to do, right? I mean, those are the questions we need to deal with, but it doesn't make sense for them to kind of go at that way. I blame somewhat Disney for this. There's my 11-year-old daughter listening to me talk for the first time. I got an 11-year-old, an 8-year-old, and a 2-year-old, right? So I watch a lot of Disney movies, right? And most of the big Disney movies, the theme was good versus evil, right? And evil not only was just evil, they were evil and they knew it, right? I mean, it was Scar and Jafar and all the, you know, and it was just like, ha, you know, I just got evil motives. And I think we train our kids that life is all about good versus evil, right? And they kind of keep that frame in a sense as they grow up. So, spoiler alert, if you haven't watched How to Train Your Dragon, you can kind of close your ears. But that's the movies our kids want you to see, right? They think they're enemies the whole movie, and then they finally figure out, wait a second, right? We can actually collaborate and work together and do things and help each other out. Adversarial politics privileges organized and entrenched voices. I'm not saying, and I purposely don't say extreme voices because I don't want to say they're extremists, right? But this kind of goes back to what voices are we hearing, right? How often have you gone to a city council meeting or a school board meeting and again, seen someone walk up to that microphone for 3 minutes and say, I'm really struggling with this issue and I see both sides and I can see wanting to do this, but if we do this, we'll also have these consequences, so good luck, you know? The only people that speak are walking up to say, this is such a clear issue, it's so obvious, you're an idiot if you're for this or if you're an idiot if you're against it, right? In some ways, those are the ones that are gonna speak. Those are the ones that are gonna send letters to the Coloradan, right? So we've set up a system that we're only hearing from the people that are sure they're right. And in most issues, not always, right? But in most issues, it's a bell curve. Most of the people are in the middle and saying, you know what, I'm struggling with this, I don't know. Well, but there's not a place for them to talk. So the impact of all this is negative side effects like polarization, cynicism, and apathy, and that creates a negative feedback loop, right? And this is what's happening with politics is when you perceive the other side as using unfair tactics, right, then that justifies you using unfair tactics, which justifies them using even more unfair tactics, which justify, you know, so then becomes this loop in a sense of that you have to play the game, right? And then when we clearly see that from the commentary of the RNC and the DNC, right, of each side pointing out all these kind of lies that they're telling, all these type of things, right? But that's the system that we've created. That's the incentive process that we've set up. And lastly, it assumes a narrow role for citizens. All citizens are our voters or pawns, right? That they're trying to kind of convince to kind of move to their side. I mean, another way of thinking, if you think about this, incentivizes bad communication. Assume y'all are the political spectrum in front of me. So we got far right over here and far left over here and kind of the middle. If I'm on the left, who do I talk to? going to talk to over here. I'm going to mobilize my base, right? I already know you're going to vote for me, but I want to make sure you send me money and you put signs on your lawn and you bug your friends and those type of things, right? So what kind of communication works to fire up my base? Probably saying bad things about you people, right? And framing things in simple ways, so you're thinking about all the values that we hold as important, and we don't really talk about, and we kind of assume that they're kind of rejecting those values, right? Who else do I talk to? Yeah, people in the middle, right? I need to kind of find that wedge issue to kind of get you on my side, right? Again, what kind of strategies are going to work to get people in the middle to my side, right? Again, simplistic strategies that kind of try to work. And then what do I do with you people? Nothing. There's no reason whatsoever for me to talk to you, right? I mean, we've created a process where there's no incentive whatsoever from people from opposing perspectives to talk to each other. And if we go back to wicked problems, to be able to deal with wicked problems, we need people from different perspectives to talk to each other and have these tough conversations, right? But it never happens. And it's happening, the internet makes it really, really easy to never have to talk to anyone you disagree with, right? I mean, no matter how freaky you think, you can find people on the internet that think just like you now, right? So we can all now get news from people that agree with us, and we can kind of set up our news stream so we only get articles that tell us what we already know and all those type of things. And it's feeding again into that human nature of we want things to be simple. We don't want to struggle with the real choices that we have. I won't spend as much time with the expert politics, but it's the same thing in a sense. There's drawbacks. Again, lots of advantages to expert politics, but it stops short of where we need to go, right? Experts, by definition, are focused on a narrow aspect of the problem. That's why you're an expert, right? You know a really whole bunch about one slice, right? But wicked problems are inherently kind of tied all together and systemic. So if we go all the way back to the slide with all the values about the river, we need experts in every single one of those boxes, right? We need experts to tell us how much water the river needs for the riparian area and for the fish and things like that. We need experts to tell us how much the farms actually need, and we need experts to tell us how much lawn and all that kind of stuff. But there's not an expert that can tell us how to rank those. Right? There's no expert that can say which one is more important as we kind of go through that. That's only something that we can do as kind of a public. Not always, but experts tend to focus on being value-free. Right? At a university, at least kind of scientific experts, they want to be able to see things. They want to be able to count things and put them in numbers, right? Which they do a lot of important work. But values don't get quantified very easily, right? So it's harder to deal with the tensions and the paradoxes in that, so they're going to study the things that they can study a little bit easier. Wicked problems can be informed but not solved by data. I've already kind of mentioned that in a sense. It kind of gives us a lot of useful information but doesn't get us all the way there. Good data is undermined in a polarized environment. This is my answer to those of you saying, but it's clear that one side does it so much worse than the other, right? And I'm not necessarily disagreeing with you on that, right, completely. But part of the argument that I make, particularly to experts or people that think for sure the data is on my side, your incentive is still to support better process, right? Because right now it's so polarized that data doesn't really matter. Right? Especially with wicked problems, they're so complicated and there's so many different kind of issues that you can always find some statistics or play with it. Or one of the quotes that it's used, I think about statistics, but I think it works for all data, is that too often we use data like a drunk uses a light post for support rather than illumination. Right? It's the notion that most of our research now I'd call strategic inquiry, which is I've got a conclusion and let me go find evidence of it. And if it's a complicated enough problem, you'll find evidence of it, right? And plus the notion of expert politics and adversarial politics being separate have come together, right? Because we've got conservative think tanks and we've got progressive think tanks and we have people that are producing data and those type of things. So what do we make of all this mess? So the argument I make to the experts that are frustrated with the public not being so informed enough to deal with these issues is if you have good process and you figure out ways of informing them, right? The data that they care so much about becomes more important. Right? And data is not just ammunition used by either side. Again, we're wired with this of wanting to be right. We can read the exact same book. Oh, here's a practical example I was talking about right beforehand. On Facebook, I went to Texas A&M, which is a pretty conservative institution. So a lot of my college friends that I'm Facebook friends with are more conservative, right? But now I'm a professor, so I tend to, most of my professor friends are gonna be more progressive. So just watching the feed in response to the Republican National Committee and the Democratic National Convention, right? I mean, next to each other, these people aren't watching the same thing, right? But once you have lens on and you're just picking out exactly what you wanna pick out, whether to celebrate it or to attack it, that's how, so even if they did have good data, we'd forget the good data the side we disagree with has, and we remember the good data that our side had. Data doesn't have a strong record with changing behavior, right? We know how to be healthy. I know how to eat right. I know how, we know all the things, and we don't do that, right? So data is important to help us understand our choices, but data doesn't solve our problems, again, because a lot of our problems are tied to behavior and individual choices in some ways, and we need to figure out better ways of kind of getting to some of those. And then like the last one, expert-dominated politics shuts out the public. Right? If it's the experts, and we see this all the time in our events, in our small group discussions, if there's an expert in the table, everyone else just turns to the expert, right? Again, we don't want to deal with the tough choices. We want the expert to decide for us, right? If the data is clear, it relieves us of making the tough choice. We like to defer to the expert in some. We've got this real schism in the United States that we want to defer to the experts, and we love our experts. We love the talking heads, the Daily Show, and Colbert does a great job of kind of making fun of kind of expert, how much we rely on experts, but then we're also rather anti-intellectual, right? And we like the kind of the everyday street, person on the street and that kind of stuff, but we go back and forth. So bottom line, what we've done so far, we face serious problems, right? We've got issues. We can kind of, the whole litany of national issues or international issues. Again, my work has shifted from presidential politics to local politics just because national depresses the heck out of me. But we've got lots of issues of dealing with. They don't have technical solutions, right? Maybe some do, but in most cases, there's not going to be some kind of scientific discovery that all of a sudden fixes these problems. They involve paradoxes and competing values, as I said. Facing them calls for productive collaboration, innovation, and coordinated action across perspectives of many areas of society, which again, we're not getting. We're getting the exact opposite, right? And current communication problem solving are inadequate and counterproductive. And, probably this is most important, we know there's better ways of doing things. From multiple disciplines, we know how to kind of complex problem solving that has paradoxes and competing values. We just don't see it in our politics nearly as much as we need to. So comes in the deliberative democracy movement, which I've been a part of, and it's just kind of a growing perspective. Started about 30, 40 years ago or so, kind of hands-on type of thing. It's kind of it's got a theoretical angle and a kind of a practical angle, and we try to kind of bounce back and forth, at least at the center. It's one of those things in academia that everyone has their own word for it. Every discipline has their own word for it. So these are some of the words. And now some of these words have also become buzz terms now that have kind of lost their meaning in a way. But the overall idea is the notion that we need to kind of have good process to be able to have the conversations we need to have and to bring people together and actually talk to each other in important ways. And I use the term public deliberation, but again, everyone uses kind of a different term, but I called my center the Center for Public Deliberation, so I think I'm stuck with that one. But deliberation is approach to politics, and again, by politics, I mean broadly how we solve problems together, in which citizens, not just experts and politicians, and that's important, I'm not replacing them, I'm saying it requires all three, right, are deeply involved in public decision making, often working with facilitators or process experts. And this is, again, the resource that I'm trying to provide the community with my students. This is not a requirement, right? But we just don't know how to talk to each other. And we've gotten so good at just talking to people we agree with and kind of making fun of the other side that typically, one of the points that I make is that one of the purposes of the center is to make itself necessary. That we'll just develop such a culture in northern Colorado that with any difficult problem, we'll say, hey, you know what, let's just get people together and sit in a circle and talk this through. I think I've got some job security, at least for a while. But working with facilitators and process experts to use a variety of deliberative techniques, and I'll kind of talk about some of those. There's lots of ways of doing this, lots of different process, and really exciting nationally because people share the work incredibly. One of the websites I'll share with you a little later is ncdd.org, which is the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation. An umbrella group of people that do this work, and everyone just shares their work. I mean, you can go on there and find 300 and 200-page workbooks on how to do this, because people are just so ready to have a different kind of conversation. Citizens come together, consider relevant facts and values, and both facts and values we need data, but we also need to talk about the values, so we need to kind of struggle with that. And my background argumentation kind of helps, because that's where I came from multiple points of view, and this is an important point to kind of, we'll hit on this a little bit more later on about democracy, but that's one of my burdens in a sense, is to make sure voices are represented in the background material, voices in the room, and those type of things, which can be a very high charge. Listen to one another in order to think critically about the various options before them. Listening, I always like asking this. So if you combine all your schooling, right, whether just K-12 or if you did some college or thing like that, how many classes did you take that was about producing messages. So like either English or public speaking or something like that. It was something about kind of having your voice in some certain way. Like show of fingers, right? How many people, I mean, most of us have English every year, right? So that's 12 right there, right? So you're probably kind of don't have enough fingers, right? How many classes did you take that had a particular, maybe not the whole class, but a particular focus on listening? I got one. Well, you're
No, because that's what
yeah, you're a counselor, right? So, listening is a huge democratic skill, a huge problem-solving skill to deal with difficult issues in diversity, right? And we're never really taught how to do it, right? So we got to learn how to listen. One of the quotes we always use about listening is from a New York governor a while back, and it said, "The art of listening in the United States is a competitive exercise in which the first person to take a breath is deemed the listener." And that's how we listen to people that disagree with us, right? We're listening for them to take a breath so we can talk, or we're listening for a flaw, right? We just want them to say a statistic that we know is wrong, and then we're just ready to jump on them as soon as they stop talking in a way, right? We don't listen to understand. We don't listen to really figure out what does this person care about, right? In certain ways. So that's a lot of what we do with the facilitators is teach them how to listen, and then they model that, and we try to create processes that help people listen to each other. Right? We'll get into this a lot more, but one of the biggest problems with our democracy is we have tons and tons and tons of ways of people to express their voice. You can do that easily on the internet. You can do it with your bumper sticker. You can do it with the 3 minutes in front of city council. You can do it with a letter to the editor, right? How many ways do we have to actually listen to each other or to actually have an interactive conversation back and forth? Democracy requires that. So I'm all for voice. I'm all for letting people kind of stand up and speak. That is democracy, right? But that's like the first step. Right? And that's primarily what we're focusing on, of how let people express themselves. But if everyone expresses themselves, but then no one actually talks to each other, we don't get very far. Right? So listening is important. Consider the underlying tensions, tough choices, and consequences. That's what I've been talking about. That's what we set up with our processes designed to help people. Let's put those tensions on the table and try to work through them, right? And really think through the consequences. Inherently, again, human nature, when we're for something, we focus on all the positive consequences of that. And we're against something, all the negative consequences. But we don't tend to nearly do as much of the work of you know what, even my great idea has some trade-offs, right? And even their horrible idea, well, they have some good reasons for doing that, right? And that's the interesting thing of the research of the people that do these kind of processes, and they're going on across the country or across the world, actually. The research shows people don't change their mind all that much. It's not like they walk into this conversation, have this great conversation, and walk out completely thinking differently. They do sometimes, right? What they typically almost always do, though, is think differently about the people they disagree with. They move from, how can anyone think that way, to, now I understand them. They're still wrong, but now I understand them, right? That's a huge move for democracy, right? The people that you disagree with being reasonable, just not as smart as you, right? You can work with that, right? Them being ignorant or them being evil or them rejecting your values, that's a little tougher to live with, right? And we need to shift and get to that first one. Are willing to refine and adapt their opinions and interests. And this is that notion of refinement. We assume, even though we're impartial, we assume people are going to change their minds in the process, right? And this is a fight I have with a lot of my political science friends that believe that interests are fixed, right? It makes it easier to study that way, right? But I've seen it, 8 years of running these things, I've seen people change their minds when they've had a good conversation. I've seen people realize, wait, I didn't think about it that way, right? Democracy requires, John Dewey talked about this, James Madison talked about this, requires us to refine our opinions, to come together and talk to each other and figure out. We're constantly trying to balance our individual rights with the community good and the rights of others and the needs and values of others. And we need that conversation to keep that going, right? And most of our politics just kind of assumes that we all just kind of have our piece and all it is this kind of competing interests, maybe they kind of combine in certain ways to be effective or strategic. But we can't assume fixed interests, right? I certainly believe in self-interest, and that's going to be important, right? But I've seen it happen lots of ways that people kind of adjust those as they go. So we need to give people a chance to kind of refine, not just express your opinion, but have a conversation and maybe even change your opinion through that. And ultimately seek to come to some conclusion for action based on reasoned public judgment. The definition of deliberation is weighing the choices that we have. So there's even if there isn't really a choice or an inherent action, it's framed like that. What should we do is the question that deliberation kind of answers. And I'll talk more about the notion of public judgment here in a second. So this is the map. This is the model that I've developed. that kind of shows the work that we do. And this is based somewhat on a big lesson I learned after the first couple years of running events, that I thought I was running cool events. I thought I was giving students a kind of a neat opportunity to get outside the classroom and do something. But I found out pretty quickly, once we were asked to do things, and these events weren't just educational opportunities to talk about an issue, but had real consequences of people making decisions based on some of that information, that what happens before the event and after the event is probably more important than the event itself. Right? So the facilitating interactive communication is what we do at our events, at our summits or our forums and all those type of things that we run. But beforehand, the deliberative issue analysis is me, and my students and other national partners, depending on the issue, researching the issue to figure out, okay, what are the underlying values? Right? What are the key data points here? What do we actually need to be talking about? What do people care about? Right? And there's a lot of processes that kind of go doing that, but it's a very different way than most people do it. Most people are doing it to frame it strategically, right, for one side to win. I'm trying, I know pure impartiality is impossible, right, but my job is to try to lay out those choices as best as possible in some ways. So that's the deliberative issue analysis. We're developing background material. We're trying to move the conversation forward. Convening is probably the hardest part of my job, which is getting the right people in the room. And sometimes that might be just meeting with one group and then another group and kind of try to deal with things. Sometimes it's trying to get everyone in the room, but doing that right is a heavy burden in a sense of to what degree do you, obviously trying to get the room to be representative, to get the key stakeholders in the room and those type of things, which can be a challenge. The joke I always make when I talk nationally is, here in Fort Collins, if I don't do my job convening well, I get white, older, progressive women. That's who shows up to my events. So if I want any of the other kind of demographics whatsoever, right, and that means if some of that is trying to get people from the right and some trying to get people from the left, I have to do my work pretty hard, right? I'm pretty sure we've had 2 events in 8 years that I had more men than women. Well, maybe 3 now within Bray. One was the bicycle summit and one was the stadium forums. I know I have to be careful saying that word around here. So then the convening and the process design, we figure out, okay, if we're bringing people together, what do we do with them? And then we capture data in lots of different ways. And we've gotten really, really good at capturing lots of data. And at the end of the event, we have lots of data. And then we have to figure out what to do with it, right? So that's where we're trying to figure out how to increase our capacity so we can do those. But we're able to kind of ask people very specific, kind of tough questions about issues and see how they react to that. And the overall idea of the cycle is hopefully each time around this cycle, we've improved the conversation. We've learned about the issue. Right? We furthered that. We know better next time what to ask even better, right? As we kind of go through. So the goal of my organization is to improve the quality of community conversation of political issues and to improve how we solve problems. I put action in the middle because at some point, yeah, we do act, right? And some of our projects have been to provide more of an institutional decision maker with data. Right? So we're giving information to the school board, or we're giving information to city council, or giving information to Tony Frank to make a decision. And sometimes it's more about mobilizing the community. More it's a problem and we just want kind of people to kind of, so we create task teams, and there's a whole kind of theory of that, of how do you move from talk to action in a way. Right? But the reason I put action in the middle, because I don't want it to be a linear process, because we're talking about wicked problems. Right? So even if we have a great action, it's not going to solve the problem. It's going to at least hopefully find a better way of balancing all these tensions and improve quality of life, right? But it still just kind of changes the dimensions in a way, right? So we'll probably get back to that issue because we'll constantly kind of be talking about that issue in a way. So that's, if you like political philosophy, it's kind of a John Dewey notion of democracy. That democracy is an ongoing conversation, right? And that we can certainly solve problems better, and we can solve problems better certainly with better ways of discussion and debate, as Dewey argued as well. So this is a map that I developed at a national conference, trying to make sense of it. It's a very interdisciplinary field. I'm in communication studies. You kind of see me over there. The first about 6 or 7 times I showed this, I had someone walk up to me afterwards saying, "You don't have me on there." So I kept on making the slices smaller and adding more text and those type of things. I've cruised for a while, so maybe someone in this audience will come up and tell me I'm missing you or I've got the words wrong. But it's exciting for me of how it's really I look some at the kind of history of universities and things like that, where universities used to be a lot more kind of connected to kind of problem solving, and then we turned to kind of the German model of education and developing new knowledge in the 19th, 20th century, and kind of compartmentalized all these departments, which there's a lot of good of that, right? We can kind of push the envelope in a lot of ways, but then I also kind of problem solving got lost with that, right? So it's interesting, especially at a land-grant institution, which has kind of a call to kind of serve the community and serve the state. kind of getting back to that core and bringing. So when I go to conferences nationally for deliberation, it's just amazing the people that are there from all over the university, and it's extradisciplinary, which I think is a word I made up. There's all kinds of organizations and community organizations and public libraries that do this work and things like that, of just people that realize we have to change the conversation to deal with the problems that we're dealing with. Again, it's so amazing to go to these conferences to hear people's stories, how they came to this. That you have lawyers that started doing kind of mediation and then realize mediation is so much of a better way of doing this than the kind of pure adversarial things, and then they figure out, oh, wait a second, maybe we can do that to public issues, right? Or you have communication scholars that used to write lots of papers about how badly politicians talk about issues and got sick of that and decided to kind of change things, right? You got activists. I have an activist friend of mine who had a heart attack at like 52. And she basically said, I can't be angry my whole life, right? I need to change the way we do things because I can't just kind of keep on screaming in a sense, right? So these are just all kind of organizations. I'm part of the National Issues Forum Network. There's about 80 organizations now. We've added 10 the last 2 years in a row. I'm part of the national faculty to train new people. But I like to show part of this because you see Georgia's in the honors program. Here's a community college. This one's an extension service. This one's in the Office of Equity and Diversity. This is a community and leadership development. This one's actually another communication program. Again, people from all over the university doing this work and connecting to it. So I'm going to go really fast just to kind of show you it's not this crazy professor in Colorado. There's a lot of other people that do this. So this is NCDD, the National Coalition of Dialogue and Deliberation. Public Agenda, Kettering Foundation, Everyday Democracy, America Speaks. The UNDP, the United Nations Development Program, has a whole program on democratic dialogue of going into communities and facilitating and helping them kind of come together in different ways. So they have a 300-page handbook you can download for free at their website. Public Conversations Project, Reuniting America, American Democracy Project, the Democracy Commitment, the Democracy Imperative. Another network I'm a part of, the University Network for Collaborative Governance. All these organizations, many of them sparking in the last 5-10 years, that are all focused on changing the conversation and being impartial resources to help us have the conversations we need to have. It basically started as a list of 8 and then went to 10, then 12, then 15, and then I think I had 17, but I just took 2 out and added 2. But the way, this is like if this is my elevator speech about deliberative democracy, if it's a really tall building in a slow elevator. But I think it helps in 4 pages to kind of touch on some of these. And I've talked about most of these already, so I can go pretty quickly. Obviously, tough choices is what I've been talking about, is that inherent to democracy, we have to make tough choices, and we need to have the conversations that help us make those tough choices. And the style of communication we have tend not to do that. I also jumped down to 13. I think one of the biggest choices we have is balancing individual interests and the public good. And we just tend to not have those conversations. Right? E.J. Dionne, and we're in the library, so I should mention books, just published a book called The Divided Political Heart, I believe, pretty recently, that talks specifically about this, that we've always in our politics had a good balance, that both parties talked about both of these, and then now we've kind of shifted in a sense that one's talking about one and one's talking about the other. And that's one of the reasons we're so polarized in difficult ways. The second concept is public judgment, which I will spend a little bit of time with. This model was developed by a pollster, Daniel Yankelovich, who'd been doing polling for 70 years, basically. And he just realized he had a bad product. And he knew that because if you ask the same people the same question a month later, you get different answers, right? Or if you change the wording just a little bit. My dissertation was on poverty and welfare issues, right? So if you ask the American people, should we do more to help poor people? Pretty high percentage, regardless of party, say yes, right? Should we do more to help welfare recipients? A really low percentage of people say yes, right? Just because you change the word, right? And a lot of the same people, right? But welfare is just a very kind of negative term where we all kind of want to help poor people. They also have these things that they would do polls on fake bills, right? So they would call, 10,000 people and say, what do you think about the passage of blah, 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 blah? And they just kind of made it up, and everyone had an opinion about that, right? Even though it didn't exist, right? So generally, public opinion polls, not so good information, right? So he started studying, and he wanted to figure out, okay, how do we improve public opinion polls? How do we actually get a good sense of what the public actually cares about? So he developed this process of moving from public opinion, which he saw as this surface opinion, right? People just answer the phone, and a lot of different problems with that of just giving the answer they think the person wants, or wanting to seem educated, so giving an answer even though they have no clue, or the person who has a really strong opinion counts exactly the same as the person that, so there's lots of issues with that. So how do we move from that to public judgment, which you define as, okay, this is opinion once people have considered the consequences. They really understand all the different sides, and they've kind of accepted the trade-offs in a way. Right? So this is a model they came up with, and it's somewhat a model for individuals, but primarily a model for a community. How does the public kind of go through the process of getting away from these kind of initial kind of assumptions to public judgment? So stage one is when we learn about an issue, so dawning awareness and greater urgency, right? This is when we get the new email, or we see we see Dateline, or the first time, I don't know if any of y'all heard about Coney 12. On campus everyone knew about it, right? First time you got the email and it's a new issue for you, right? And typically a new issue is framed in a very strategic way by the person that cares about that issue, right? So automatically there's greater urgency. We must do something, right? So then you start stage two, which is the working through process. The first part of stage two, reaching for solutions and wishful thinking, that's where human nature takes over. We want things to be simple. We want it to be good versus evil. Wishful thinking is really dominant. Primarily wishful thinking means we have a devil figure, right? We assume the problem is all because of them. If we just get rid of them, right? So we're hearing a lot of people, if we just get rid of Obama, everything will be fine. Just like 4 years ago, if we just get rid of Bush, everything will be fine, right? And we just kind of personalize that in some ways, right? Or if we just get rid of oil companies, the energy crisis will be solved, right? If we just get rid of insurance companies, healthcare will be solved. I'm not saying oil companies and health insurance companies are great things, but it's not that simple, right? But that's the way to kind of focus things. Or the opposite of wishful thinking, or the other side of wishful thinking is a magic bullet. You assume, oh, if we just do this, right? If we increase teacher salaries, or if we include this, or do this, it will solve the problem. So we initially lash on to wishful thinking. Eventually, if we have a good process, we start weighing the choices. We start realizing, wait, it's not that simple. We start realizing there's trade-offs. We start realizing the people that we disagree with have some good stuff there, right? Maybe they're not just kind of completely out of it. If we get past that, then we can get to resolution. We can take a stand intellectually. Okay, now I've got this strong opinion, this judgment, and then we might move to kind of advocating that, right? The problem with our society is we don't do much of the weighing the choices, right? We have all kind of mechanisms for stage one, and we have all kind of mechanisms for stage three. The internet's great at that, right? Of passing on issues and individual kind of perspectives in a way. We just don't have the institutions for weighing the choices. We don't have the places to come together. We started this off talking about public libraries, a place to come together. It's a safe place, right? It's one of the few institutions we have left, right? And I don't want to be so nostalgic that we used to just always kind of get together and have these conversations, but we did used to have a lot more community organizations that would bring people together from different perspectives, right? That Republicans and Democrats or whatever would actually have conversations and know each other, right? Now we kind of live more in enclaves, and we kind of deal with people at work more, where you don't talk about politics, and all these kind of things, that we don't tend to have the conversations that we used to have that really helped us explore the other side. Another way of thinking about this. This is probably the one big takeaway I want you to have, and this is on the slide. But this is Sam Kainer's book. This is the book I use to train my facilitators. And the book is primarily for organizational, kind of how do organizations make tough decisions and kind of involve their employees in decisions and those type of things. But his work just applies to democracy so well in my eyes. So this is a process that he argues that we need to go through when we're making a difficult decision. First, we need divergent thinking. We need processes that help us get voices in the room. Right? Too often what happens is we cut off those voices too soon. Right? How many times have you been in a meeting, right, to make a decision, and everyone seems to love the decision, right? You've got some problems with it, but no one likes meetings, right? So if you speak up, the meeting gets longer, which is bad, right? And you kind of start thinking, well, everyone seems to know what they're talking about, right? So they go with it. Of course, it flops, and then what do you say? I knew it wasn't going to work, right? Actually, everyone in the room says, I knew it wasn't going to work, but no one spoke up. So typically, and he talks about in the book, like how many great ideas died just because the person who had that idea didn't feel comfortable speaking, or maybe wasn't as articulate as other people, or didn't have a position, or those type of things, right? So good process is critical for this part, to get divergent thinking, to get voices in the room that aren't really there. One of the challenges, a serious challenge to deliberation, is the notion of, okay, if we do decision making by who shows up to public meetings, right, it's going to be the usual suspects. It's going to be the powerful. It's going to be the status quo, right? The people that need to be in the room, are not going to even hear about your meeting, right? If they hear about your meeting, they're not going to be able to go because they're working 2 jobs or the bus doesn't go there. Right? If they hear about the meeting and they're able to go, they won't feel comfortable speaking because it's just not their kind of thing to kind of speak in public. Or if they hear about it and they go and they're comfortable speaking, they're not going to be listened to, right? Those are 4 challenges to my work that I take seriously, right? How do I kind of get them in the room? How do I make sure they're comfortable speaking? How do I get their voice heard? How do I make sure other people listen to them as we kind of go through to make sure that we have enough divergent thinking, right? That we get beyond kind of the basic kind of assumptions. The problem is if you do a really good job of divergent thinking, you get to the groan zone. Right? And I love this as a training tool for my facilitators because I can tell them if you're at a table and it's really, really hard, it means you're doing it right. It's supposed to be hard, right? Democracy's hard. Living together with people that think differently is hard, right? So the grown zone is the working through process from Yankelovich, right? The notion, okay, once we have all these opinions in the room, now we need to start making sense of them and developing mutual understanding, right? And realizing these tensions we have and try to make sense of them and kind of work through them in a way. But eventually, we can't talk forever, right? I'm a communication professor. I want to talk a lot, but we can't talk forever. So we need some convergent thinking. We need to start making some decisions. We need to start making some priorities. We need to make some action plans, right? And eventually, maybe some decision point. Whether that, in some cases, that decision point might be consensus, which for me is a scary word, right? Consensus tends to close off too many voices. We're not going to all agree. Whether it ends out being some sort of vote or there's a lot of different terms that people use, confluence and things like that. But at some point we decide. But again, the problems, the drawbacks that we have is if we cut off too early, we don't allow enough divergent opinion, we silence dissent, right? We have a false consensus. We think everyone agrees because we didn't let anyone that disagreed talk, right? And that happens a lot, not as much. We have a pretty strong free speech tradition here, but obviously there's voices that don't get heard or don't have the power. The more money matters more than anything in politics, obviously we don't hear the voices that don't have enough money. If we do a really good job of divergent thinking, but we exit the grown zone too early, we have false polarization, right? We have all the opinions in the room, but we haven't had time to talk through them, right? So we actually kind of exaggerate that. And I think this is mainly what we get, right? Because we have ways of hearing voices. We have the, again, letters to the editor and then walk up to the microphone and bumper stickers, things like that. So we have lots of ways of people to express their individual opinion, but we don't have good ways of working through them. So we get this false polarization. We think we're more polarized than we actually are. And again, my experience the last 7 years is you put people in the room, have a good conversation, they realize, wow, you're not nearly as evil as I thought you were. And they again, not consensus, they're not going to all agree, but they realize what they agree on is much more manageable. Or you can get stuck in the grown zone, right? That you talk forever, and that's the process by analysis, right? That there's just too many issues to go with that you don't know, right? So that's the process-wise, the work that I'm trying to do is we need better tools for divergent thinking to make sure we get the voices in the room, right? We need better tools for working through, right? Once we get all those voices, how do we kind of make sense of them, move forward? We need better tools in our community for convergent thinking. Is okay, how do we move to action? How do we prioritize? How do we start making decisions? We can't just talk forever. Right? So that's another map and a way of thinking about the work that we try to do. Though I don't like this because it's a linear process, right? So then I just kind of stick it into my cycle, right? So each time I have a meeting, sometimes I'll have meetings just about divergent thinking. We're exploring a new issue. We just want to hear how people talk about this issue, right? Sometimes the meeting is set up primarily to kind of work through, that we have materials that do the divergent thinking, and we can give people the options, and we can kind of take a shortcut and kind of start in the middle in a sense, right? And then sometimes our meetings are a little bit more about the convergent thinking of saying, you know what, we need to make some decisions. We need to act, right? Even though, again, we'll always keep the conversation going some. Democratic governance is another key kind of theory. And this is the notion that communities solve problems. Another reason why I moved from national to community, right? Especially when you get students engaged in an issue, local issues, they can kind of take a bite out of it a little bit more. So you see a broad range, with all the issues we're thinking, there's a broad range of actors, right? A broad range of stakeholders that can act in multiple ways. Too often our politics focuses either on individuals making choices or individual responsibility or government, right? And those are two pretty important things, but we've got a whole bunch of mediating institutions in the middle that need to be more a part of the conversation. Most of the wicked problems that we're dealing with, especially locally, are going to take a combination of individuals making different decisions, but also maybe some changes in laws at multiple levels, but also we have so many, Fort Collins is such a wonderful place with nonprofits that work in different ways. But also private institutions. We need to get private institutions more involved. They're not exempt from democracy, right? So they need to be a part of conversation. That's that's one of my hard jobs of kind of getting them in a room in some way. So you think about the individual, you think about interpersonal level. The distinction here is, have you ever been the one person in your household to try to be on the diet? It doesn't work too well, right? So you kind of need with choices for your networks to kind of be part of it. Organizations, social institutions, faith institutions can be a part of this. We've been working with Concerned Larimer for the last 4 or 5 years that works to get faith institutions more involved in community issues. And then also the relationship among those organizations. The Pathways Past Poverty project that we work with the United Way was to get nonprofits to work together better and kind of think more systemically and long term about how they're working in kind of important ways. The next two, and this is kind of where it takes a change in a sense, that I'm serving as an impartial perspective, right? But impartial, I've had some good debates with my national partners about what's the right word, right? I never like neutral, that's just too boring, right? And third party isn't right because there's lots of different parties with lots of these issues, right? And transpartisan, one of those words that just kind of sounds too fancy. So I stuck with impartiality, but the more I did this work, and particularly the more I try to convince really good students to do my program, and the genius of my program is I get to handpick my students, right? So I bring in about 15, but these are really sharp students that kind of do some great work. But to sell those students, I came up with a concept called passionate impartiality. And it's purposely an oxymoron, right? But the idea is, I mean, hopefully you've got a sense from this talk that I'm pretty passionate about what I do. I'm passionate about my community, I'm passionate about solving problems, I'm passionate about democracy, right? I just made a choice 8 years ago that I believe I'm gonna have more of an impact on my community by playing this impartial role and focusing on process and focusing on helping people have better conversations than just picking a side and fighting for it, right? So the passionate impartiality means that while we are impartial about the specific issues we're working with, we're actually partisan about democracy. Right? We have normative values about democracy, which means equality and inclusion is a normative value that we have, right? We want voices to be heard. We want to deal with power issues and some, so that opens up kind of a whole another universe in a way of some of the things that we're dealing with. So we are part of a movement, even though we're impartial, right? I think this is one of the signs of like Colbert's rally, right? So one way of thinking about the work that we do is the deliberative practitioner is kind of in the middle between the public and the advocates, the adversarial, the voices, right? We need those, and that goes back to the pros and cons of each, why I don't want to get rid of adversarial politics. We need those interest groups. We need the people that feel passionate about those issues, right? Because they're the ones that are fueling, they're the ones that help us, they're the voices we need to get in the room, right? They're the values and the passion that's part of it. I couldn't do the work that I do mapping out the value dilemmas without people from all those different perspectives making their arguments, right? The problem is what I'm trying to do is help us get through the groan zone, which is getting all those arguments in the same room and creating some clash in a way, right? We need decision makers or politicians in most cases because those are the ones that have the big levers, right, in some ways. And those are the ones that bring the legitimacy to process in some senses. And obviously we need the experts because we need good information. And democracy requires high quality communication across these three perspectives, which just doesn't happen naturally, right? So that's the work that we're trying to develop, this local capacity for a different way of talking to each other. Another way of thinking about this is there's an inherent tension in what I do. I like the word tension, between being impartial, right, but then honoring quality and inclusion. So one of the things is we train our facilitators that if there's a dominant voice that's shutting out a voice, their job is to step in, right? So they're violating pure impartiality for the sake of democracy, right? But that's a tough choice we'll make. The same thing is we'll violate pure impartiality for the importance of good data, right? If one person seems to have really good information, the other person seems to really be making stuff up, right? If we're impartial, we're kind of on the side of the person making stuff up, right? So that's some of the stuff that we're really struggling with in the sense of what is our role? I mean, how much do we fact checking? What are we doing, before the event, during the event, and after the event to kind of make sure that good that even though data is not going to answer the questions for us, there's still ways of making judgments between good data and bad data, right? And having data help us make those choices. And that's some of the stuff that kind of we're working on. So again, going back to that, how at its best, deliberative politics brings out the best in the other two, right? We need the values and the passion and the voices of adversarial politics. We need the good data and the research from expert politics, but then we need to figure out a way of making that all work together, right? And that's the process focus that we bring. The good news is that there's growing resources for passion and partiality, right? Typically, it's not a natural resource. Going back to the oxymoron, right? There's not that many people that are really fired up about not having an opinion. I think the reason my program works so well is college students are a great resource for passion and partiality, right? I mean, it's hard for me, and we do some community advocates, and one of the things that we're doing, we've got a training coming up that people are really interested. You can kind of come to an all-day training for free that will kind of give you the same training we give some of our students, and we have some of those community people help with events, right? But it's hard to find enough community people that are really passionate about the community but don't have positions, right? That can be the impartial person at the table when people are like, wait a second, weren't you just at city council? For me bringing students in, these students are passionate, right? But they're not connected to city issues that much, right? Or at least they're not known in the city, so they can kind of play that role in really interesting ways. But there's a whole net, there's all these organizations that are kind of developing, kind of doing this work, these networks that I'm a part of, for-profit and nonprofit firms, actually Colorado and Denver and Boulder are kind of key hubs of this kind of work. Conflict management programs, extension, CSU Extension is now buying me out of a class so I can start training extension agents and kind of working more with extension agents across the state on collaborative process and this kind of work. Public libraries, again, some of my partners are librarians that do this work and kind of, instead of being a communication professor, they're a librarian that can develop this on their own. Community organizations, you have organizations like United Way kind of becoming more of a convener, right? Nationally, they're working with some of the partners that I work with Harvard Institutes to figure out, okay, how do we not just kind of be this pass-through for money and things like that, but how do we actually kind of get people to kind of talk to each other and work together? But Community Foundation, the Community Foundation Northern Colorado kind of does the same thing. IAP2 is the International Association of Public Participation, and they talk about the move from PR to P2, or from public relations to public participation. And this is the new generation. Every city, every county, every school district has a PR person who's the community information officer, or the liaison with the community. Traditionally, they've been trained as PR people on how to sell a message. And they're realizing that doesn't work so well with a public that's angry and educated and those type of things. So more and more, that person, or at least a counterpart of that person, is a process person. How do we get the public to work together versus how to sell a message, right? The old school PR is, they call it the DAD method, which is decide, announce, defend, right? So the decision makers make the decision and they announce it to the public and they just wait for the public reaction, right? That's why when I ask people that work with city government, if no one shows up to a public hearing, is that a good thing or a bad thing? And it's typically considered a good thing, right? Because the only people that show up are the ones that complain, right? So if no one shows up, no one's mad enough, so it's probably a good decision, right? Which is not exactly how I think democracy should work. And then additional government resources. So again, a lot from the top down now. National League of Cities in particular, really active on training city council and managers and things like that of kind of a different process. How do we get people talking to each other? Not just the one at a time at the microphone, right? Which is just not a high quality kind of communication. We need the interaction. To do the groan zone, to do the working through, you need interaction. You need people talking to each other. So to go back to the first picture I showed you, all our events, 100 people show up, we split them up into tables of 8, and I have the capacity, because I've got 30 trained students, to have students at each one of those, to do that. So with that, the role of citizens, the role of government, the role of experts, and the role of media have all changed. I've kind of already talked about all these. The citizens, instead of just being voters or just being customers, a lot of local government kind of uses the metaphor of they're paying taxes for a product, right, which I think is just a thin view of citizenship in a way. The citizen has to be a problem solver. Right? And it's a high burden, and this is one of the cons to my position. I'll completely admit it, right? That we expect a lot out of citizens. Right? That's why we have to be careful on what projects we pick. We can't use deliberative politics for every issue because we can't expect everyone to come out to a meeting every single night, right? But it has to be a tool in the community toolkit to deal with these issues. The role of government changes. Instead of being the primary problem solver, it becomes the convener, right? Still a key problem solver, right? But the conversation doesn't start there, right? And it changes the conversation somewhat. The role of experts, one of the phrases that's used is experts should be on tap, not on top, right? So they're available, they're ready, right, to help answer questions. They help us before the event, help us after the event, sometimes during the event, which we found can be dangerous. But again, the experts can't get us all the way there, but they can be helpful along the way. The hopefulness of this kind of ties with, I've talked a lot about flaws in human nature and how we want things to be simple and want things to be good for, we were selective listeners and selective readers and those type of things. But anyone who's really pro-democracy has to have a lot of faith in human nature. You assume in most cases, put in the right situation, people can be reasonable, right? The exciting thing is in 8 years, this has been proven more correct than I believed at all. We're dealing with lots of different issues, bringing people together on some tough issues. We don't necessarily take on the toughest issues, right? Because I'm dealing with 18-year-old students, right? So we're not going to take the really inflammatory thing. But we did the stadium, we did water rights. We've done some pretty tough issues in a sense, right? And I can count on my hand in the 7 years how many just really difficult people that just kind of refused to be part of the conversation that I had to take over, right? I mean, every event, my students are all going, and I'm kind of walking around waiting for my student to kind of say, I need help. It just doesn't happen, right? I just don't know if those people don't show up, or the reason we get the angry people with a microphone and things like that is because they don't feel they're being heard. In a good process, they realize they're being heard, or what. But it's amazing, and this has been shown with lots of different processes across. Europe uses these processes for like highly technical, like bioengineered food choices and things like that. And if you have enough time, you have a good information, it's amazing what the public can do when you put them in a situation to succeed and you give them a role other than complainer. Right? So my faith in human nature grows if you put them in the right situations. It's Aristotelian in a sense that we have the potential to do this, right? We can develop a culture of it, a habit of it, right? And that's the most exciting part of my work is at the end of every single one of the events, people walking up to me saying, we need to do this with this issue, right? Just realizing so quickly that it's a better way of talking to each other and we need to cultivate it more. Same thing, the wisdom of crowds. Crowds on their own tend to make bad decisions, right? Group communication is another class I teach, right? And groups inherently, bandwagon effect and things like that. And that's where my students, again, they start thinking, we're just an impartial facilitator, They realize how much power they have because how one question can change a conversation, right? That you ask an initial question and the first person says, this is the best idea ever. Then the next 6 people automatically say, it's awesome because, and then the facilitator says, so what are we missing here? What's the case against this? And all of a sudden the next 10 comments are negative, right? So groups on their own, doesn't work too well, right? There's lots of problems. Groups that are facilitated, groups that have good process, groups that are planned out can come up with things that individuals that, there's a wisdom there that can be captured, but both the human nature and the wisdom of crowds have potential that we need to figure out how to reach, right? And that's the constant learning process that we're going through is how to do that, right? How do we get people to change the conversation so they can kind of do more of these things? So this all goes back to now interactive communication. I use the term interactive communication even though that seems repetitive. Communication should inherently be interactive. But again, most of it's not, right? Most of our political communication is one way, right? It's a bumper sticker, it's a t-shirt, it's the 5 minutes at the microphone, it's the letter to the editor, I guess there's some interaction on the Colorado message board, but that's not quite the model of democracy, right? If you don't spend too much time on there, I wouldn't recommend it. So facilitating interactive communication is how do we put people in situations talking to each other, right? And we kind of go through. Again, the grown zone requires that. We can do divergent thinking. We can do it with individuals, right? It's great. The Colorado message board is wonderful information for me to see how people are thinking and see the different sides, right? But then we need another mechanism so we can take all those different ideas and help people work through them, right? So the working through process requires interaction, requires people actually talking to each other in some ways. So I'll just throw out a couple of things and kind of trying to get done here pretty quickly. So debate, dialogue, and deliberation are kind of the 3 Ds, 3 interactive communication technologies that we use in some important ways. When I started this work, and a lot of people that do my work, debate's a bad word, but I was convinced at a conference by some debaters saying, the bad debate's bad, but good debate's good. The problem is most of our debate's bad, right? When you see the presidential debates here coming in a few weeks, it's not really a debate, right? It's a joint press conference, right? And they've got talking points going in. Those talking points are going to come out regardless of the question, right? And I think a very astute viewer can get a lot from a debate because they can really kind of see things and kind of make that clash. But a good debate is when there's clash and people are really, that debate kind of acts as a way to really clarify the issues and kind of clean them up, right? One story I think that's worth telling here. So when I came to CSU, one of the classes I took control of is our argumentation debate class, right? And pretty much every communication department in the country has this class. What we do, which I think is pretty typical, what we did, pretty typical is 24 students in the class, they get 6 teams of 4 students each, they pick an issue, they frame the issue as a yes-no issue, should the United States close its borders or something like that, right? And then they research it. They have to have all these evidence cards and do like a 30-page brief, so it's data, right? It's expert politics, right? And then they have a debate, a 2-on-2 kind of competitive academic debate. Then they switch sides, right? And they do debate again, right? And as I started doing, this is before I started the center, at the end of the semester, after the second debate, they've spent 4 smart students all semester long studying an issue like crazy, right? And they normally pick the issue because they're passionate about it. They were on one side, right? At the end, after the second debate, I'd say, okay, you're no longer affirmative or negative or whatever. You're just a real person that studied this for a whole semester. What do you think about this issue? Hmm? High majority. I'm talking 85%. I don't know. They got to the groan zone, right? Wherever that, yeah, there we go. They got to the groan zone, right? They realized now this is a very complicated issue, but they got stuck in the groan zone, right? And I think most of them went home and went, I'm just gonna go watch TV, right? Instead of being passionate about that issue, right? And I figured out it's because That's very much of an expert and adversarial model, and it's based on yes, no, but we're not going to research our way to if they picked a decent issue, right? And we make them pick an issue that there's evidence on both sides, right? So inherently they spent all semester long focusing on yes or no, right? And they never got anywhere because there wasn't a yes or no, right? But there was the 4 people in the group, none of them were struggling with the middle ground, right? So what we do with the class now is first half exactly the same. Pick an issue, frame it that way, because debate's a useful tool, and they need to use debate well, right? Knowing how data works and where the data lies, and bad arguments should go down as bad arguments, and good arguments should be held up as good arguments, right? So I believe all that stuff, right? But then now, instead of switching sides, I'd still love to switch sides, we just don't have time for it. So after they have the first debate, now they turn in and they create a discussion guide. Their role is not to come up with the answer, their role is to be a mapper, to lay out the issues for the community. Here's the issue we have, and here's the choices we have. And typically, it's kind of the national issues framework, one of the organizations I work with. They frame it as, here's a common problem, and here's 3 choices we have, 3 approaches, right? Each approach inherently has trade-offs. There's no magic bullet, right? So we can do this, and if we do this, it honors these values and it has these good consequences, but we have to kind of give up these things, right? And the second choice and the third choice, all 3 do the same thing, right? And it creates a different kind of conversation. Because people realize we all agree it's a problem, we got to do something, right? And then we realize pretty quickly through that conversation that there is no magic bullet, and we're going to have to make some tough choices, right? So kind of a sneak preview in a sense, we'll basically be doing something every month with a series year long. 3 of those will be forms in that model, right? And I've got some of the material up here on how to talk about those things, just to see how a different conversation works, right? Some of these will kind of be more national issues. We typically don't do national issues because we want all these things to have kind of these practical, hands-on, kind of move to action in the community. But that's one of the reasons why we started this library series. Is it gives us a chance to talk about some of these bigger issues, but more of an educational setting, right? These aren't going to be these huge projects we're doing. It's just going to be a 2-hour conversation just to kind of show you how a different kind of conversation works, right? In the meantime, we'll be doing other projects in the community that are tied to action that you'll be able to get involved with if you want to. So that's the notion of debate. In that class, I think, is another example of good deliberative politics bringing out the best out of adversarial and expert, right? We still needed the data, we still needed the information, we still needed the voices. Part of their research is go to advocacy groups and find all that argument, see what they're saying, right? But their job at the end, and I think it's a great metaphor for the role of expert in society. The expert can't make the decisions for us, but they can lay out the options for us. They can say, these are the choices that you have, and these are the consequences of those choices that help us have these conversations we need to have. So that's debate. Dialogue is, and we do some dialogue, but dialogue is more deliberation without the decision making. You're focusing more on developing trust and understanding. And those are for those issues that are just people can't be in the same room talking about making choices together. They first just have to understand each other, right? So there's some issues that we start off with dialogue and then move to deliberation, and some issues that's more about dialogue. I'll actually be leaving here today to go to a dialogue that we're working on right now. NCDD, the National Coalition of Dialogue and Deliberation, engagement streams. And this is a great document. I put the website on the bottom, I think, right? Maybe not. Well, it's just ncd.org, or you can Google engagement streams. But this is kind of the toolkit. These are all the different ways of doing this work, right? So they do 4 big categories. Processes for exploration, processes for conflict transformation, processes for decision making, processes for collaborative action. It's just kind of a great resource that lays out the toolkit. And my job as one of these local centers, locally kind of embedded centers, is I play with all these tools, right? So regardless, whatever issue comes up, we think about, okay, what's the best way to engage this, right? Some of these tools are 2-hour meetings. Some of them are all-day meetings. Some of them are 2 hours a day, once a week for 6 weeks. Some of them are online. Some of them are face-to-face. Some of them use all kinds of technology. America Speaks does these meetings that there's 15 cities at the same time, and they're all linked together, and every table has a computer, and they're taking notes, and there's a theme team that's looking all this kind of stuff going on, right? We've got the clickers, we've got some technology as we kind of go through, but it's just all these ways of just getting people to talk to each other differently, and we're very much a learning organization, constantly trying new ways of doing these as we kind of go through. And then again, there's whole other ways of thinking about moving to action that's kind of part of it as well. I've got about 6 or 7 copies of this one because it's about 30 pages long, but again, email it and I'll send it to you. But this is another piece I wrote just about the goals of deliberation, what we're trying to do. Right? So the first order goals, kind of inherent consequences, people learn about the issue, they learn about each other, they develop relationships which are critical. They move from the person that disagrees with me is evil to the person that disagrees with me has good reasons, which is not as good as mine. and improve relationships. So those are kind of the first order kind of inherent goals. A lot of our projects are more tied to action. So we want individual or collective action. We're sparking, we're mobilizing the community in a way, or we want better decision making. And so our first big project with the school district was on grade configuration in, what was that, 2007 or so, right? So we were providing information of the public voice to the decision makers. And then the third order goals are the broader kind of purpose of my center, which is to increase capacity of my community to solve problems. So every time we pick a project, we're kind of picking at least on these two grounds. We want to make a difference on that issue, right? But more than anything, we want that issue to help us learn about how to do this so we can do this for the next issue, right? And kind of slowly and surely kind of build more of a culture for collaborative process and for deliberative democracy in Northern Colorado. So I'll end with the last kind of notion is striving for an unreachable ideal. It's the notion that we're never going to have the perfect democracy. If we go back to the slide with the preamble of the Constitution, it talks about to move toward a more perfect union. We're never going to perfect the union. I'm never going to have the perfectly representative room. I'm never going to have background materials that's perfectly impartial, right? I'm never going to train my facilitators to always ask the perfect right question, right? But I do think we can have a better conversation, and we can have a better room, and we can have more voices heard, and we can have better material that helps us deal with the decisions better, and we can kind of be as a more honest broker of information than we tend to get otherwise. So that's the goal that we have for our organization is each time around that cycle, we improve the conversation, we move closer to making better decisions and to be able to make a better decision next time. So to close, we'll do questions here for about 30 minutes or so. This is a series, I think you got the handout in the back as you want to go. So there's a couple we're doing a little Democracy Book Club, and the Kettering Foundation, who sponsors the National Issues Forum process, has funded these, so you can get a free book. I think we got them in the back if you want. So this is going to be October 10th, and we'll get together to talk about David Matthews' books, Politics of the People. Then we'll do a forum on higher education's role in society, which is a new book developed by NIF, and I've got some copies of those if you want to look, pretty short little discussion guide, just to be part of a national conversation to think about the role of higher ed. So that won't be specific necessarily to CSU, it's going to be a broader kind of a research nationally. Then we'll come back together in January and do another book called The Civic Renewal Movement, which is just kind of a good survey of a lot of things that are going on in journalism and in youth education and in higher education, in different organizations of getting people to kind of innovate and to think about communities differently in important ways, and we'll hopefully pull some ideas from that. And then we'll end in February and April with two more forums, one about energy issues that's framed from public agenda, and then another one that we're framing that we'll kind of play with it as we kind of go along, but to kind of cap off the series to really talk about how do we improve community. That's framed in a sense of how do we improve adversarial politics, how do we improve expert politics, and how do we improve deliberative politics? Because again, all three of them are critical tools. And while my work obviously focuses on deliberative, all three of them need to improve for us to kind of move forward. But with that, again, thank you for your time. And I'll stick around for quite a while if there's questions. And again, I've got some material here. People like. Yeah. Yeah, so she's asking if I'm aware of how a lot of this stuff is going on with the Occupy movement. I haven't connected as much with the Occupy movement, but I know a lot of they're using process. They try to have nightly meetings in a sense, and they're using some of these kind of techniques in a sense within their meetings and those type of things. Yeah, so what I'll try to repeat the question so we can get on the microphone and other people can hear, but saying that he's finding that there's just such an explosion of information. There's so much information out there now. And I think that a lot of what I do with my students and my other classes is, giving them mechanisms to handle all that, right? And that's part of Yankeliewicz's book. He came out with a book in the early 90s. It's a great book. I'd love to do it for the book series, but we couldn't get free copies of that one. Is Coming to Public Judgment, and he had just a new one called Towards Wiser Public Judgment. But he talks specifically kind of about that in a sense that we've always kind of reached for this holy grail of the informed citizen, right? And if the citizen had enough information, they make such better decisions. And he argued that's not it. I mean, information's important, right? But we need judgment. We need ways of dealing with this. So this top-down notion of the people with information informing the public enough to make better decisions is kind of a myth in a way. And I think that bears it out even more since 1993 that there's just so much information out there that we need to work more on how do we kind of use that information to make decisions versus just developing new information. Yeah, I mean, I think kind of going back and the notion of this takes time to do right? And a lot of times the argument is you have to go slow in order to go fast, right? That, what we have right now is we have good mechanisms for divergent thinking, and then we skip to a decision point, right? Or we have a whole bunch of talk, and then we have a vote, right? But part of the problem, this goes back to the zero sum. Like, I think healthcare is a good example, right? Our politics now, right now, is okay. Let's mobilize people, right? If we get 51%, we can pass it, right? And we win. Implementation is probably more important than passing it, right? And if you have 49% of the country dedicating to making something fail, it's not going to work very well, right? Or dedicating to taking over office to get rid of it. And again, this happens both ways, right? So I think that's that notion of, yeah, we can do things quick and we can kind of mobilize people and kind of push something through. And maybe that works. And I'm not saying it always doesn't work. But I think with these broader issues, long term that won't work. The decision, there's not enough that, gives me a chance to talk about the one I skipped. I didn't talk about legitimacy. But part of the notion of a good process, it gives it more legitimacy. It gives it procedural legitimacy. People believe in the process, right? And you see tons of examples of these with a tough issue, that if there's a good process and people really felt heard and were there to hear other people, the decisions made that they disagree with, right? They're likely to say, I think that's a wrong decision, but they'll support it, right? Instead of dedicating their life to end it, right? So there's always going to be a tension in the work between short-term and long-term, and how much time do we have to talk about this and those type of things. And as I pick topics to deal with, that's one of the things I have to think about, right? If they need a decision now, I can't be involved because or if they're already, they're at stage 7 of 10, it's kind of too late for me in some ways, right? But that's always going to be a tension of having enough time to do it right? Yeah. So the point he's making is one of his mentors talked about win-win situations and made the argument that conflict can't be resolved, it can only be managed. I completely agree with that. So the notion of wicked problems is conflict is inevitable, right? We're not going to solve these differences, right? So conflict is automatic. I mean, I teach my students always start off kind of going, oh, what if people disagree? And I'm like, well, they got to disagree. They're going to disagree. Our job is to make that conflict productive. Right? There's a lot of wisdom in conflict. That the clash of different perspectives, if done right, can really kind of create some insights and innovation in a way. So even to the point, there's a lot of conflict resolution programs, and I think those work kind of for specific conflicts. But typically, the public conflict, they use conflict transformation or conflict management. They won't say conflict resolution because in democracy, we're not going to resolve these conflicts. What we're going to do is hopefully form a more perfect union and move closer and closer to finding the perfect balance between all these in some ways. But it's kind of it's that striving for unreachable ideal. We're never going to get there, but I think on the way there is a pretty good result in a way. Right? So he's asking that I haven't used the word truth, so have I consciously avoided that word? And it kind of, I think with wicked problems, I would, I guess, and I'm just kind of thinking out loud here, so I'm not sure where I'm going, but I tend to not use, so I like truth in terms of data, right? There's some information that kind of is solid data in a sense, right? I don't think we're going to get to kind of capital T truth in the sense of this is the right way to run a city, right? This is the perfect way to, so typically that's too high of a burden in a way, right? And this comes from my background's in rhetorical studies, right? So it's always been in that middle ground, right? That we on one end we have, there is capital T truth, and we just need to find it in a sense, which is, whether that's through science or whether that's through kind of, dialectic and Plato and kind of rationalism, or whether that's through religion or whatever. Or on the opposite side, there's kind of nihilism that there is no truth and everyone's truth is their own. Argumentation and rhetoric has always kind of been in the middle, right? That we can say this argument is better than this, there's ways of judging reasons, and some reasons are better than others, right? But we're not going to quite get to that. This is the unchanging truth that won't change. When you're talking about public policy issues, right? You can talk about it more in kind of specific kind of things. In class, my graduate course this week, we just finished Gorgias, and now we're reading Phaedrus. So yeah, we start right there with, and the reason we start with Greece, at least I should always kind of, in terms of what we know about Western civilization, right? We start with Greek because that's when democracy started, right? That's when we started wanting people, or at least very limited democracy, wanted people to have some control over the decisions. And that's when rhetoric was born, because rhetoric is this art of how do we make decisions? How do we deal with uncertainty? How do we still make decisions even though we're not going to arrive to truth and just do that, right? We're always going to be kind of muddling through, but there's better and worse ways of muddling through. We're muddling through badly right now. Back there and then go. Yeah, and I think a lot of that is, again, we're not going to come to consensus, right? So at some point we do have to make decisions, right, in some ways, and a lot of times that might have to just kind of go to a vote of some way or some authority kind of making that decision. But certainly with the notion of the cycle is that conversation has to continue. We want to capture that, and we want to kind of continuously kind of before. Part of the theory that I didn't spend time with today, it really kind of talks about specifically the notion of deliberative inquiry as a process of inquiry, right? So what I'm doing is research in a way, right? That we're getting different kind of sense of the public voice because we're being very proactive about putting things in front of them and see how they do it. And we're capturing, and some of the key things that we're really capturing is what are the key obstacles moving forward? What are the misconceptions? What are the fact questions? Where people, different sides that we can research and maybe resolve the next time? And what's the common ground we can build on? What are the key tensions and the differences we need to work through more? And what's the broad range of stakeholders that might be involved in this? So a lot of that of the minority report or the information continues on even though the decision's kind of made in a way. Yeah, so what he's asking is, I focus on local politics, to what degree kind of taking this to national or looking at kind of more organized party politics, and even if individual politicians kind of go through this process in a sense when they go back to their caucus, when they go back to their party. Right, yeah, I think there's a lot of, actually I'm surprised because normally that's the first question. Literally every time I give this talk, the first question is, how can we scale this up to national? And normally my answer is, part of it is kind of a grassroots thing. Yeah, there was the growing zone right there. Part of it is, so I'm very active in growing centers like mine, right? There's already a Center of Public Deliberation in the University of Houston downtown, and there's several. We brought in 20 new ones. So part of my theory is the more individual communities that figure out how to do it right, the more they'll start demanding more. Right? I remember the second semester when we did the healthcare thing, when we had the state healthcare kind of policies, and so we had a couple of representatives from Denver come down just to watch, to observe. And one of them walked over, we had like 3 groups going, and they were just kind of walking around. And one of them walked up to me and said, we need to do this in Denver. I'm like, you think? But there's so many different pressures in there, and money and party politics, those type of things. The really interesting thing for me, and I'm not a political scientist, and I'm not a political historian, so, but if you think about, Congress was designed to do this, right? Congress was designed as a deliberative body. The notion was, there was fear that, the founders, like democracy is scary. They're gonna form factions and scream at each other and things like that. So what we need to do is develop a system of elect the best of them and then send them and then have them in a room talking to each other, right? So if you go to Congress, if you go to Denver, it's a round room. Everyone's supposed to be talking to each other, right? And the idea is that's when they're gonna do this work, right? And it's not happening that way, right? The decisions are made long before they walk in. And I meant to kind of grab this graph that showed like the most conservative Democrat and most liberal conservative and used to kind of cross, right? And now it's kind of doesn't even cross. So that's some scary stuff. So there are people that do this work. There are people that do this work nationally. Like America Speaks, try to have these national conversations, and God bless them. I hope they do well. It's tough work. So I'm going to focus local and hopefully kind of, and the other thing is hopefully the leaders of the local leaders today become the state representatives of tomorrow, and then maybe kind of get to Washington in a way. But the incentive processes are so messed up there that I'm hopeful locally. No, I guess the end of the story that I was telling there is I think it's flipped from when the founders, right? The founders said the people can't do it, so we'll just elect representatives and they'll deliberate. Now it's the opposite. The people can deliberate. We've seen that. You give them a good process, they can take on tough. America Speaks had a great process summer before last on debt issues, and they had move-on people next to Tea Partiers with good information and good process. They did some great things. Now politics took over, and they were funded by a combination of foundations, some of them progressive and some of them conservative, right? So then the blogosphere tore up the process, right? Because all the conservative bloggers said, oh, look, this is just a paid for by, they picked out and vice versa, right? So I know the people that run the process, I know why they were doing it, I know that, and then it got completely destroyed as biased politically. So that's the danger of trying to do these things nationally. But they showed people could have these conversations and do that. So I think that I completely agree with you that our differences are exaggerated. I do a process with my students in some of my classes where I first have them brainstorm, okay, what are the primary values of Democrats, primary values of Republicans, and then I get that all, compile it, give it back to them, and then I get them in groups and say, organize, okay, which one of these do you think is fair to that group or positively framed, which are negative, and they pretty quickly figure out, yeah, wait a second, it's not as bad. Part of this is the polarization, right? Because of the polarization, because of the game, each side's going to start using these tactics to make sure that they win, right? And then that's what increases the polarization because we see them do those things. And they're using tactics that's how they play the game. But I completely agree that our actual differences, there are real differences. I'm not saying we completely agree, but the differences we have are much more manageable. I think we're polarized as a country, but I think individual people, if they have good conversations, can depolarize pretty quickly. Yeah, so kind of what he's saying is, yeah, maybe you can have a process that the people come to agreement, but then how do you kind of move that mechanism up to kind of change laws and those type of things. Yeah, and that's kind of part of the challenge in a sense, and that's part of what, I mean, as we scale up, we're a lot of people in my field are kind of working about how do we embed deliberation more in kind of local politics and kind of moving up. And there's a lot of people working at the state level as well in a sense. And I think where there's hopefulness is there's issues that politicians won't touch because it's just not politically advantageous, right? Or to take a position is kind of too dangerous. But they can play, to go back to the role of government, they can play the convener role, right? So you're seeing more and more examples of this, of governments funding a process, right? To let the kind of process play out in a sense, and then seeing how that can kind of come back to policy. Because again, I think the public can engage these issues in ways that they can't. Now, that involves them giving up power, which it's harder to do the higher you go up in a sense. One great example of this is the state of Oregon uses a tool called Citizens Jury, which is one of these deliberative tools that we talked about. They've used it 2 years ago, and then they're using it this semester. The associate director of the center, she just left, Leah Spray, now at University of Colorado. Her replacement's coming in January, and she's running this in Oregon right now. And then she'll be here in January, Katie Knobloch. But they basically run a referendum issue on 2 issues. The last time it was medical marijuana and mandatory sentencing for sex crimes or something like that. They got a representative jury of about 16 people, or somewhat representative jury, and a week long they deliberated. So they brought in advocates for each side of it as witnesses, and they kind of appealed to the jury. Then the jury deliberated with a facilitator, kind of helping them through. They also videotaped all of this, so this is all partly research. Then they voted, and they created a caucus for and against. And then the caucuses had 1 page to summarize the arguments. These are the reasons why we think this is a good law or why it's not. And the government had agreed beforehand to put those into the blue book. Right? So the voting blue book that everyone got was the results of a week-long deliberative process of people really thinking through that issue. And it was interesting because with the mandatory sentencing, the like kind of final statement by the advocates on one side showed a video that was like sensational and kind of just completely kind of emotion value based, that kind of stuff. And the jury got angry because they're like, we've spent 4 days talking through this and struggling with it, and then you're gonna give us this 30-second soundbite kind of thing, So they were kind of admonished in a way, which I think is very interesting. So those kind of processes, that's government saying, I think it was funded outside. I'm not completely positive, but it was government giving power to that process, at least kind of an outlet for it. So hopefully, there's people working on that. Is how do we scale this up, and how do we embed this more? And I think more like National League of Cities, they're realizing we have to deal with the public better, right? That we can't just, the public is more knowledgeable, has more access. It's so easy to organize. I mean, so many of the issues that we've dealt with, something comes up and later that day there's a Facebook page and, interest groups have formed and, all these type of kind of things that happens so quickly that I think government's realizing we have to engage public differently. And I think the budget problems lately have also done that, right? Because people realize government can't do everything it wants to do. We have to inherently make choices. So people are starting to change that conversation. Not quite. Now, everything I do is with students, right? So during the summer, I don't have students in some ways, so things kind of calm down and we get ramped up again. So yeah, and there's, the Forest Service and a lot of the techniques that we use were originally developed as a result of the EPA, because when the EPA was passed in the early 70s, it required a level of public engagement that's never been required before. So that created a lot of innovation. And a lot of it for environmentalists, they realize that it's hard to play power politics from an environmental perspective because the other side always tends to have more money. So environmentalists have always typically said we need to change the conversation and kind of, we can't assume the worst of our enemy because the enemy's too powerful. So how do we change the conversation certain ways? So a lot of it with Forest Service and land management, they've always kind of used these kind of processes, and that's where we borrow some of these. And Leah Spray, my colleague, has done a lot more kind of in that area, but she's been asked by the Forest Service to do trainings and to do workshops and those type of things. So I imagine it will come up. a hand in the back, I think. Yeah, I skipped over that one too as well, the role of media. I mean, I think typically media makes it's hard for, conflict is always going to sell more than cooperation, right? And the fact that people want things to be easy, right? And that's why, you know, Fox News and MSNBC and all that kind of stuff has developed and is so popular, because people want to kind of, you know, get the news from that perspective in a way. So I think the model in itself kind of feeds itself, which is the problem. What I'm really hopeful of, and I've started some of these conversations and pushing more, is that you see nationally at least, there's some, in one of the books I almost kind of went with, that if we continue this next year, maybe I'll go with, or there's interest, I can get you a copy, of looking at the role of journalism, kind of, what is the role of journalism in democracy? And particularly what you're seeing is locally, and the Coloradan could be a great example of this, right? That they're fighting, you know, one of y'all mentioned that they're fighting for survival in a way, because people get their news, you know, on the internet nationally like that. But a local news source could be this resource, right? Could be the lay choices out and kind of do the work of deliberative democracy, and can be a really important partner. And we have partnered in certain things, and I need to try to spend more time to kind of develop the possibility of that kind of relationship in a sense. You also have, I mean, online generally, internet generally kind of fuels, again, preaching to your own choir and those type of things. But there's lots of great tools online for deliberative stuff, and there's lots of communities that have really healthy online forums that can be, you know, it's actually interesting, because I always ask my students at the end of the first semester, you know, what things are you interested in for next semester, and what do you kind of want to work on? And, you know, some of them might want to kind of do more theory, or some might have a specific topic, whatever. For 7 years, I've always asked, you know, online deliberation, like, would you want to kind of focus on that? We haven't done much of that, but there's all this stuff out there, right? There's a lot of techies that believe the internet's going to save democracy. And I've never had a student pick that as their focus area. And I've always thought, I mean, technology and internet, students love this stuff. And I think I finally figured out that real people in a circle talking to each other, that's new technology, right? Like internet, like, I've been doing internet since I was 3. That's boring, right? But real people having a conversation, like, whoa, that's like mind, you know? So, basically, the internet's really good, again, for divergent opinion and for expressing your opinion, not so good for interaction, not so good for going back and forth, right? So you're saying we need more regional kind of conversations, that it's too national, or? Yeah, a little bit. I mean, there is a lot of interesting research. Trying to think what the book, The Big Sort is a book that talks about how so many different, it's more kind of at the, you know, legislative level, or kind of representative or kind of Senate districts in a sense, how they've been kind of adjusted so much that so many of them are one party or the other, so there's no debate in a sense. I haven't seen as much in the regional kind of thing, right? What you are seeing kind of at the region, kind of from the perspective of our work, and we've done this specifically with the Northern Colorado region with Embrace Colorado, it's an organization that we've helped try to do some of this work, that at least in Colorado, it's each city, it's kind of each city for its own, because sales taxes are so huge, and all the individual cities are competitors. But for people, we're a region. I mean, so many people live in one city and work in another city and shop in another city, those type of things, but there's very weak regional governance in any kind of sense. So he's been trying to kind of develop that in a sense of how do we think as a region and kind of start those kind of conversations. And that notion of scope is always a difficult one for us, in the sense of when we're talking about an issue, you know, are we talking about Fort Collins, or are we talking about Larimer County, or are we talking about Northern Colorado, or we're talking about the city, you know, and there's no right answer to kind of that. But I do, the other way, I don't know if this kind of connects to that. I mean, I know with part of the reason I shifted from national to local, because I think there's lots of local decisions that are pretty important. I mean, there's a lot of issues, quality of life issues that are local, even though obviously a lot of big issues are kind of national in a sense. But most of my students, politics was national. You know, politics was the president. You know, politics was the Daily Show. You know, and there's no way for them to be connected if that's it, right? They know they can't pick up the phone and call the president and change their mind, right? But when you get like local issues, you see people change their mind all the time, right? And so that notion of trying to give them a sense of efficacy, that they can actually change things, you know, that's one of the reasons we went local. And I think there's a harm of so much of our politics just being seen at this national level, because it just feeds that notion of, as citizens, we don't have power, right? Which is one of the themes as a transition of politics of the people, in a sense. The argument that David Matthews, one of the arguments he makes in there, and Yankelovich would make the argument as well, is that there is a lot of apathy. There's a lot of people that are just kind of checked out of politics, but it's pretty thin, right? And it's not that hard to get people back engaged if you give them a good process, if they believe they have an impact and those type of things. So that's the exciting part of the work that I've been doing, in a sense, is that you give people an alternative and they realize, well, wait a second, this is something in a way. And I think we can overcome that apathy if we just give people an alternative. So, thank you.